John worked long nights at the office to provide for his family. His wife Sarah and 2 children depended on him. At night when he returned home after the kids were asleep, he would eat dinner with Sarah, then lay down in their bedroom while she watched TV. One night as John tried to fall asleep, he heard a scratching sound coming from the walls of their home. At first it was faint, but it grew louder and more persistent. John ignored it at first, but it disturbed his sleep. The next night John mentioned the noise to Sarah. At first she didn't hear anything, but as the scratching grew louder she finally heard it. The couple grew concerned. They checked the walls for any obvious source of the noise, but found nothing. The scratching continued each night, growing louder and more persistent, always in the same area of the wall by their bed. Sarah insisted they must have mice, but no traps caught anything. John inspected the room thoroughly, finding no holes, pipes, or wiring that would explain the noise. Their children heard it too and grew frightened. Weeks went by and the family could no longer ignore the scratching that came every night. John began researching options, afraid something was inside the walls, something unnatural. As the noise invaded their peace of mind, the couple grew paranoid and tired. Their children began having nightmares. One night the scratching was louder than they had ever heard it. John lay awake with Sarah, staring at the walls in the dark. Suddenly, the scratching stopped, then a cracking sound came from inside the wall. A hole appeared and 2 dark eyes stared back at them from the darkness. That was the last night the family slept soundly in that house again. Both John and Sarah gasped in horror at the sight of the 2 dark eyes staring at them from the hole in the wall. Whatever creature was hiding there briefly gazed at them before slowly closing the hole and retreating back into the darkness. The family sat up all night, too terrified to sleep but unable to leave their house. As dawn arrived they ventured out of their room cautiously, checking on their children who were still asleep. John called the police to report a possible break-in by an intruder. Officers arrived and searched the house thoroughly but found no signs of forced entry or anyone hidden inside. They had no explanation for the scratching sounds or the hole in the wall. That night the family slept together in the living room, lights on and too frightened to sleep. The scratching began again, louder and more persistent than before. Sarah began to cry and the children clung to their parents in fear. John felt a rage building inside him. Whatever was in those walls was threatening his family. Grabbing a sledgehammer from the garage, John began pounding on the wall where the scratching was loudest. After destroying a large section of the drywall, a gnarled gray claw reached out towards John. With a roar of anger, John attacked the claw with the sledgehammer. A high-pitched shriek came from the hole as a misshapen creature crawled out, blood pouring from multiple wounds. John continued beating it until it stopped moving. The family sat in shocked silence, traumatized by what they had witnessed. They knew they could never feel safe in that house again. They would have to leave everything behind and start over somewhere new, somewhere the darkness in those walls could not find them. The family quickly began packing only what they could carry. John boarded up the hole in the wall to contain whatever remained of the creature. They fled the house in the dark of night, not daring to stay until dawn. They drove for hours, stopping only for gas before finding a cheap motel to rest. No one slept that night as the horror of what had happened weighed heavily on their minds. Questions swirled with no answers. What was that creature and why was it in their walls? Had it been watching them all that time? John reported the break-in to the police the next morning, but omitted details of the creature. The family knew no one would believe their story. They continued driving aimlessly, unsure of where to go next or how to move on from this nightmare. After days on the road, John found an old farmhouse for sale far from the life they knew. Though run down, it seemed secluded and peaceful. They decided to start over, repairing the house themselves and keeping to themselves. For a while, all seemed well. The family focused on renovating their new home, keeping busy to escape their fear and trauma. But one night, as John tucked the children into bed, he heard a faint scratching sound from the walls of the farmhouse. The family realized then that the nightmare would never truly end. Whatever evil had found them in that first house had somehow followed them, or was already lying in wait. They were not safe anywhere, for the darkness had marked them as its prey. John and his family froze in fear as the familiar scratching sound came from the walls of their new home. The nightmare they had hoped to escape had followed them, and they realized the horror was not over. John gathered his frightened family close, determined to protect them at all costs. He grabbed an axe they had been using for renovations and stood guard as his wife and children huddled together on the bed. The scratching grew louder and more frantic, as if the creature knew it had been discovered. Holes began to appear in the walls as clawed fingers tore through the old wooden boards. John swung the axe, taking chunks out of the wall but not stopping the creature's advance. Suddenly, a deformed gray arm reached through a hole, grabbing at Sarah. With a cry of rage, John hacked at the limb with the axe until it retreated. But more holes began appearing as the creature attacked from all sides, trying to get to John's terrified family. John knew they could not survive this onslaught. Protecting his loved ones with his body, he said a prayer for their souls as claws broke through the walls on all sides. The creature's high-pitched shrieks filled the air as it descended upon the defenseless family. Darkness swallowed them, and then there was only silence in that old farmhouse. Whatever evil had preyed upon them would not stop until it had claimed them all.